Hello everyone. In this presentation, the history of parallels, we will look at how God has worked throughout human history. Now, people often think that history repeats itself as a common thought, but historians haven't usually studied history from the point of view of God's providence. So therefore, in this presentation, we want to compare the history of ancient Israel, recorded in the Bible, with the history of Christianity on a world level. Now, usually we have no reason to do this, but in this presentation, the Reverend Sun Myung Moon realized there's a very important principle behind human history, which is God's providence to lay a foundation to be able to send the Messiah. Now, so we'll look at this point by point. But first of all, we want to compare it with a little bit with one popular view, the cross-centered view of history. This holds that from the time of Adam to history, that Jesus' death was foreordained by God and is the main process of salvation. So we have the cross at the center of human history. But Reverend Sun Myung Moon discovered a principle that helps us to understand the real meaning and process of history, what enables history to progress. And that is, there's a partnership between God and human beings. It's like this: God's responsibility is 95%, human responsibility is 5%. Only when these two are combined is the fulfillment of God's will. And the reason for this is that God created human beings with free will and responsibility for the simple reason He wanted to create with human beings. It's a relationship that is is very important to God. For example, God created the whole universe. That's all God's work. We could say 95%. Only to say that God does almost everything. But it's 5% portion of responsibility that Adam and Eve were to fulfill, was to obey the commandment and fulfill their growth. Although it's such a small part in comparison to God's, without it, God's will is not fulfilled. For the simple reason God has created the universe for human beings to live with human beings. So if we fail in our responsibility, God's will is not realized. Or God will prepare the whole history of Israel, like a foundation to send the Messiah. When Jesus came, human beings' responsibility was to accept Jesus and follow Him. And only on this basis will God's will be realized. But unfortunately, people rejected Jesus and killed Him, so God's will was not realized. So therefore, a second coming is needed. So therefore, the real view of history, we reject the cross-centered view of history, because the cross was not the foreordained plan of God. So neither Adam and Eve's fall or Jesus' rejection and crucifixion were foreordained by God, but the result of human failure. Salvation is restoration and will go on until God's original will is realized. So what happens is that God created human beings at the beginning. They fell, but God never gives up in human beings because He loves humanity. So He will work the basis to try to restore us back. When Jesus came, people rejected Him, but Jesus died on the cross, and this sacrifice enabled spiritual salvation to occur and a basis for a second coming much later. So it's restoration view of history. Also, it's important to look at this, that from the time of Adam until the Lord of the second advent, second coming of Christ, there's three histories. The first 2,000 years, God worked on a family level. That's from Adam until Jacob. It's not real time, it's biblical time. You know, for example, Adam lived to 930 years, and his son came over 900 years, and then so there's 10 generations from Adam until Noah. This means that Cain should have been around at the time of the flood, but we know it's not the case. But it does have meaning though, even though it's symbolic time. But God worked in this time to make a foundation on a family level. So it took most of history, so thousands of years, basically. But when Jacob appeared, a family level foundation for the Messiah was accomplished, then God could work on a national level in preparation to send the Messiah. So this was 2,000 years image time, real time. We call this the age of restoration. And then from Jesus was supposed to be accepted and followed, although he was rejected. Then God promised a second coming will appear. And then, therefore, the 2,000 years from the time of Jesus until today, we call this the prolongation of restoration, simply because it should not have been necessary, but the result of human failure. But God will never give up in humanity because of his love for us. But God always works on a higher level. So this level is God works on a world level with Christianity worldwide. Reverend Sun Myung Moon states in Exposition of the Divine Principle that to find historical records pertaining to God's work of restoration in the New Testament, we must consult, in addition, the entire history of Christianity from Jesus' time to the present day. Recognizing a pattern of parallel periods, we come to know more clearly that history has been shaped by the systematic and lawful providence of the living God. And so therefore, we are comparing two histories. The history of Israel, from when Jacob, he earned the name Israel, when he overcome the angel at the ford of Jabbok, and there's 2,000 years until Jesus came, the age of restoration, where God worked on a national level. We're comparing these stage by stage with the history of Christianity from the time of Jesus until the present day. Another 2,000 years, the prolongation of restoration. So we look at these age by age. There's 6 periods in each, and we'll compare each one. Firstly, due to Abraham's failure in the offering, in Genesis 15:13, 400 years of slavery would come about. And then Jacob commenced this period with his 12 sons and 70 kinsmen. The conditions in this time were circumcision, sacrifices and Sabbath. These are conditions they had to keep their faith. But they suffered slavery, oppression from the Egyptians for 400 years. Until the end of this time, when Moses appeared and delivered them out of Egypt, and they worshipped the tabernacle. The tabernacle was a symbolic Messiah. They worshipped this tabernacle as like a moving temple throughout, and they could keep their faith as long as they kept faith in the tabernacle. This parallels the period of the 400 years of persecution under Rome due to the crucifixion of Jesus. Now Jesus, after his resurrection, commenced this period with his 12 apostles and 70 disciples. The conditions they kept at this time were baptism, sacraments. The sacrifices mean that their own lives in many cases, and they keep in the Sabbath. The Christians suffered miserably in this time, being oppressed by the Roman emperors, particularly Nero, but they had to keep their faith through these very severe circumstances. Constantine accepted Christianity to one degree, but it wasn't until Theodosius in 392 that Christianity was made the state religion of the empire. And in the year 400, where Rome itself was sacked by Germanic tribes, Augustine is a significant person. This time he wrote the City of God, and the Christians in this period worshipped the New Testament church, and this was a symbolic Messiah. Keeping faith in the church was a condition of their faith. Now, after the 400 years of slavery in Egypt, Moses delivered them, succeeded by Joshua. They entered a new land of Canaan, their own land. But this period we call the 400 years period of judges, where they're ruled by judges who had the triple function of prophet, chief priest and ruler at that time. Now, the external Israelites were the ones who led, but it was the second generation in Numbers 14:31 to 32, because they did not keep faith through the wandering in the wilderness time. God said that your second generation, those who kept faith, together with Joshua and Caleb, only they will enter the new land. They entered it, they become like a new nation of God's elect. What parallel this period is a 400-year period of patriarchs, church patriarchs. The patriarchs, similar to the judges, served the role of prophet, chief priest and ruler. Now the Israelites, their mission was passed on to the Germanic tribes. As we saw already, Rome was sacked by Germanic tribes. But all over Europe, Germanic tribes were pagan originally, but although they rebelled against Rome, they accepted Christianity, Christian teachings, and they're the ones who spearheaded the missionary movements around Europe, brought Christianity around Europe at that time. Now in Israel, ancient Israel, after the period of Judges, God wanted to have one king in Israel. Therefore the last last judge rather, Samuel, ordained Saul king of Israel. God wanted to have one king in Israel, build the temple, lay a foundation for the Messiah. Unfortunately, Saul lost faith quite soon. So God couldn't work with him. He disobeyed God. Samuel ordained David king. David was a very faithful person originally, but after committing adultery with Uriah's wife, Bathsheba, God couldn't work with David anymore. Then God called Solomon. But Solomon also fell into lust. So although Solomon built the temple, he did what God wanted initially, but he had so many wives, he fell into lust. So of course God couldn't work with him. But the idea of this time, the idea of the temple centering on the king, Jesus is the substantial temple, the Messiah to come. But the foundation to receive the Messiah, foundation of faith, was the central person, was the king, conditional object, was the building of the temple, and the set time was 40 years. That's why each of those kings reigned for 40 years. Having accomplished that, the foundation of substance would have been the king in the able position and the prophet in the Cain position. The unity between both, the whole nation would have been united and the Messiah could have come. But unfortunately, because they failed, the kings failed, Samuel didn't fail himself, but the kings failed to keep faith, then Satan invaded this period and the Messiah could not come. Likewise, in the parallel period of the Christian history, we have 120 years of the United Christian Kingdom. Exactly the year Christmas Day, 800, Pope Leo III, who like the Patriarch of Rome, he ordained Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, the Holy Roman Emperor. The ideal of the Church centering on the Emperor. The Lord's Second Advent, second coming of Christ, is the substantial Church. The foundation to receive the Messiah, the foundation of faith, the central person was the Emperor. Conditional object is the building of the Church. And the set time was 40 years. The foundation of substance would have been the Emperor in the able position and the Pope in the Cain position. They have to unite with the Emperor, become one. But unfortunately, those divisions, they could not unite, and then Satan invaded this period. So just like when an individual falls, just like when Adam fell, he was divided into Cain and Abel, and their unity was to restore the family, which we know did not happen, which failed. So likewise a kingdom, God is working in a kingdom kingdom of Israel to send a Messiah, when the kingdom falls, it is also divided into Cain and Abel. And the idea is that Cain, one's further away from God, unite with one closer to God, was Abel. That's why the kingdom of Israel was divided into the northern Israel, it's the 10 tribes, the Cain position, who were influenced more by the Canaanites, if we lost their faith. And southern Judah, Abel, they kept their faith longer. In this period, where people like Elijah and many other prophets were going to the north, trying to get them to repent and return to faith in the one God. In this picture here, we have Elijah confronting King Ahab, and many other things like this. But unfortunately, the northern kingdom did not repent of their ways, and eventually God couldn't protect them anymore through bad conditions. And Assyria, the big empire at the time, invaded northern Israel and took them away into captivity. And thus the 10 lost tribes of Israel from that time. In a parallel period, we have 400 years of divided kingdom of East and West. In this time, Europe, the nations are not very clear like they are today. They're divided into West Franks, which is France, and some parts of other European nations who are not formed. East Franks in the Abel position. Countries like Italy, parts of Germany, parts of Austria, and so on. Francis of Assisi, he appeared at this time. He was a person we could compare to Elijah. He's trying to bring humanity back to the simple faith in God. But the church at that time was getting more and more concerned with material matters. But this period also failed, basically. The two kingdoms could not unite. And so, ancient Israel, the northern kingdom, as I just mentioned, lost. They were invaded by Assyria, taken away into captivity. Now southern Judah, they were still intact at this time in the Abel position. But instead of keeping their faith, they lost their faith. And they likewise forgot about worshipping the one God. So God couldn't protect them anymore because of their bad conditions. So we have the exile period where Babylon, another big empire this time, invaded southern Judah, took them away into captivity. But the interesting thing happened here. While they were in captivity, another empire at the time, Persia, went to war with Babylon and then defeated Babylon. Now King Cyrus of Persia allowed the Jews to go back to their homeland and even financed the building of the temple. So it's an amazing thing that happened after 210 years. Now in the Christian period, the 210 years of exile in Avignon and return, King Philip of France, at this time in 1309, he was in the Cain kingdom, if you remember, who was more materialistically concerned. The Pope at that time, there was only one faith, only one church at that time. When everyone was going to church at that time, they were paying their donations to the church, but all the money were going to Rome to support the church. King Philip of France thought that the only reason for this is that the centre of the church is at Rome. So he thought if he took the Pope to Avignon, he set up the centre of Christianity there, all the money would go there instead. So that is exactly what he did. He kidnapped the Pope. So the exile period in Avignon. So it was a period of time when the centre of Christianity was in Avignon in France. So this caused many divisions in the church. It wasn't until 1517 until the whole issue was resolved, and then there was one Pope again in Rome. Now in Israel, ancient Israel, there's a 400-year preparation for the Messiah. Just after the Babylonian exile, they came back. They've been in exile for 210 years. Great prophet Malachi, along with others like Ezra, and so on, they regained re-inspired the people to believe in the one God, and the God of the Scriptures. And we can say that incredible changes took place in this 400 years until when Jesus came. Reformation of faith. There were lost people, you can imagine, after such a long period. But when Jesus came, we can see many different religious organizations, like Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and so on, the kingdom under King Herod. A big change in this 400 years. Israel was part of the Roman Empire at that time. And the Roman Empire was famous for its roads. It went throughout the empire to create ease of travel. And prior to Roman Empire, we had the Greek Empire that spread their language everywhere. So the Greek language is spoken everywhere. We can see this is real preparation that God had for the coming of Jesus at that time. Because God's mind, He wants to save the world. So He won't just prepare just the nation itself through the Scriptures, rather He created the whole external environment too. We know when Paul came, the Apostle Paul, he was able to spread the gospel throughout the Mediterranean world very quickly. For two reasons. For the Roman roads, they enabled his travel to be relatively easy, and the Greek language. That's what, as we know, the Greek language is the language of the New Testament. Without the Greek language, it would have been difficult to spread the message that quickly. But you can imagine if it was Jesus himself who was accepted, if he was accepted by Israel and then the Roman Empire, he could have spread the message just as quickly, or even much more quickly than Paul, and he could have reached the world. But unfortunately, people did not understand that Jesus was the Messiah. They had their own concepts of Messiah, and they thought he was a false Messiah, and they crucified him. And tragically, Jesus died a very painful death on the cross. He was ridiculed. But he did promise that a second coming will come about. Now, the 400-year preparation for the second coming of Messiah started in 1517, when Martin Luther translated the Bible into the German language. But prior to him, many people like John Wycliffe, almost 200 years before that, translated the Bible into English and other languages. But the church had such a power at the time, they ruthlessly put down these people, these reformers. They killed them. John Wycliffe was killed, his Bibles were burned. But Martin Luther was the first successful one, because he lived at the time. He had the benefit of the printing press that was established, didn't exist before this. So his message could reach out to the world at that time. So he brought freedom of faith for the first time, so people could read the Scriptures in their own language. So it's like the Reformation. The Renaissance came, they brought an external change. There's a rapid rise in science. People asked Jesus once what it would be like at the time of the second coming. And he said in Luke 17:24, as lightning flashes across the sky, so will the Son of Man be in his day. If you live in an ancient world, like Jesus' time, if you are trying to compare the situation of the world today, what one word would you use? It'd be difficult. But when you think of lightning, what do you think? Lightning means speed. And quite truly, today's word of speed. You can travel like lightning, by airplane, very fast, communicate through emails, telephone, lightning speed. In the ancient world, it's not well like that at all. And so if you would describe the modern world, lightning is a very accurate way. The ease of communication too, through democracy in the world, this is not there by accident. This is the foundation God wanted to use to give freedom of faith, so the gospel and God's words and Messiah's words can reach to every corner of the earth. Without democracy, it would be very difficult to spread one idea to another country. And the ease of God allowed the empire, the French, the Spanish, the English, have colonized the world, and because of this you have ease of communication, similar to in Jesus' time with the Greek language. And then Jesus said that when the gospel is preached to every corner of the earth, then the end will come. Well, we know that the Bible has been translated into every language. Even the very small nations has been translated. It could be read in all those languages. But then, despite all these great glorious things that Jesus said would be what will happen, he then put a question in Luke 18:8. But when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? He put a question because Jesus could say that because he experienced the first coming. When Jesus came, there was great faith on earth from the point of view in belief in the Messiah. In ancient Israel, at the time of Jesus' birth, for example, they were very religious people. Jewish people were very religious people. They were prepared by God. There were Sadducees, Pharisees, Essenes, and many more who really believed in the scriptures and were waiting for the Messiah. But when Jesus came as the Messiah, from the point of view and belief in Jesus as the Messiah, there was no faith. Very few people. By the time Jesus was killed, everyone lost faith, because they had their own expectation of the Messiah. So Jesus put that question because it only makes sense. If Jesus comes, well, the second coming of Christ comes again as a man, will people believe? It's quite a challenge. Now I put these dates, 1917 to 1930, that the Messiah should be born on the earth. The reason is because from 1517 to 1917 is 400 years. There are 400 years of preparation for the Messiah. But if we add up the dates from when the beginning is a whole 2,000 year period, it comes to 1930 years. So between these two dates, 1917 and 1930, Messiah was born on the earth. Now this is great news. We have to look, but we have to learn from history. For example, at what were people thinking at the time of Jesus? Well, there's two kinds of prophecies at that time, before Jesus came, about the Messiah. There were prophecies like Daniel 7:13. They said that the Son of Man will come in the clouds of heaven. But of course we have verses like Micah 5:2 and 4. They say he'd be born on the earth, even the right place, Bethlehem. But we need to examine what the people thought, and we can compare this with people's thinking today. Of course, there's in the New Testament verses like Matthew 24:30. It says that Messiah will come on the clouds in great glory. But there is passages like Revelations 12:5 that says he come by birth on the earth. It says she brought forth a male child, one who is going to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. The child is caught up to God and sits upon the throne of God. This is very clearly the Messiah. So we have very parallel verses. But to understand what people thought at the time of Jesus, this is the important thing. And we can find that out from a person who was alive at that time. And that's the Apostle John. And it says in 2 John verse 7, it says, "Many deceivers have gone out into the world, those who do not confess that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh. Any such person is the deceiver and the Antichrist." They gave the reason why people did not believe in Jesus, simply because he was in the flesh. He was in a physical body. It means they were expecting something different, a supernatural coming, but not a human being coming in the flesh. That's the reason why they didn't believe Jesus. So they would have believed Jesus come in the clouds, something like that. They would have seen Micah 5:2 and 4, but it would have gave that a symbolic meaning. But we know they were wrong. Jesus was born on the earth. He was born in Bethlehem. So therefore, we're likely, if the Bible is consistent, we can very easily make the same mistake today. It's a very common belief among many Christians that the Messiah Christ will come again on the clouds. But he never came on the clouds the first time. No one ever came on clouds. So it's more likely that the second coming of Christ will take place by a birth on the earth, exactly as Revelations 12:5 states. I want to look at now, at the time of Jesus, what was God's plan? Because God is going to send the most important person in history at that time. He prepared ancient Israel, as we've seen, but he's also prepared the whole world. God is sending a Messiah not just for Israel, but for all of humanity. And so it was not by accident Israel was part of the Roman Empire. Now, the Roman Empire was famous for its Roman roads, went straight in every direction. And we know, for example, Paul, the Apostle Paul, after Jesus died, he was able to spread the gospel throughout all the Mediterranean world for a very short time, for a simple reason. But the Roman roads, ease of transportation around the empire, and also the Greek language that spread throughout the Mediterranean world. And so imagine if it was Jesus, if he was accepted by Israel at that time, and the Romans accepted him. Through the Roman Empire, Jesus himself could have gone very quickly, even quicker, throughout the Mediterranean world, but he wouldn't have stopped there. He would have reached out to the whole world. And so therefore, in the world, we see foundations throughout the world. Socrates, for example, in Greece, is a philosopher, but he was a philosopher who died in the belief of one God. And so he was prepared by God to meet Jesus. That way of thought. Confucius, the idea of the ethics of Confucianism, very similar to Christianity. Buddhism, likewise. Jesus could have reached, and these different peoples throughout the world could have received Jesus, and the kingdom of heaven could have been realized on the earth at that time. But sadly, when Jesus was rejected and killed, he never left even Israel. Instead, he promised the second coming will come to realize this. Today, we're living in a world where democracy was found in Christianity originally. Democracy may not be a perfect system, but at least it enables freedom of thought and freedom of travel. And so through the Messiah will come in a small nation among the democratic world, and through this he will be able to spread his word throughout the whole world and realize the kingdom of heaven at that time. And so what we just explained is the two histories, the age of restoration, history of Israel, and which should have been concluded with Jesus, but because of his undue death, we have the prolongation, the whole Christian history, to restore this today. But prior to all this, we had the 2,000 years of the foundation for restoration. And as I mentioned before, this is symbolic time, it's a much longer period. There's a foundation where God had to work to lay a foundation for the Messiah. Then he could work on a national level with Israel. So this is great news. We're living at a time now where the Messiah is among us, basically. And who would have thought at the time of Jesus that the most important person was among them? They lived at a time of confusion, just like today. There was conflicts, wars, and they didn't see any way out of their confusion. But the very person, the only person who could have led them out of that confusion into an ideal world was among them. And they failed to recognize him, and instead they killed him. We're living now at a time when the most important person has been among us, the only person who can lead us out of this confusion into an ideal world. Now this is really more than great news. We might be thinking, oh, well, should there be dramatic things happening if the Messiah came? Maybe he died already, all these things. But that's why it's very important to understand what the Messiah comes to do. He comes to realize the ideal family on this earth, to realize God's lineage on the earth. If that is done, it may be here. We may not recognize it. And that's why Jesus did say once, in fact, you desire to see it one of the days of the Son of Man, but you will not see it. You will not see it if you're looking for something different from that. If you're looking for external signs, big glorious things happening, of course you'll fail to see what is really important, what really God is doing on the earth. So this is really more than great news. You know, as I mentioned, between 1970 and 1930 the Messiah was born on the earth. So I really encourage you to study the scriptures, study more of this and find out, so you yourself can participate in this great age that we're living on today.